everyone, this is Elizabeth, and today we're going to get a little gross. On more than one occasion, I have read the phrase ground into mincemeat while skimming through newspaper articles in the National Archives. So today I decided to do a search on the phrase and, oh my, the things I turned up are unsettling and downright scary. And since I had to read them, I am going to share the worst of the worst with you. First, in 1884, it was reported out of Portland, Dakota, that a threshing machine was in operation and the band cutter accidentally cut the feeder's hand. The feeder snatched a knife and stabbed the band cutter, completely opening his abdomen, leaving his bowels exposed. The band cutter, seeing that he had been fatally stabbed and knowing that he had but a few moments to live, grabbed his murderer and, in his desperation, hurled him into the cylinder of the machine, where he was ground into mincemeat. Then, a few years later, in 1892, Berlin, it was reported that a servant in the family of a butcher of the city had been convicted of a horrible crime. The girl, having given birth to an illegitimate child, sought to conceal her shame by killing the infant and destroying all trace of its remains. She accordingly put the body of the child into a sausage machine in her master's shop and ground the flesh to mincemeat. The crime was discovered, however, by the butcher, whose experienced eye detected in the meat a small fragment of bone. He was led to investigate matters and soon obtained a confession from the unhappy murderess. And for the record, this was not the only account of human meat making its way into the butcher shop. However, the majority of mincemeat events happened at mills and on the railroad tracks. For instance, in 1903, Indiana, a 47-year-old man fell into the crusher at the cement plant. As the article states, he was literally ground to mincemeat. As for railroad tracks, there are plenty of mincemeat reports in the archives. For example, in 1904 Ohio, the front brakeman on freight train number 85 had orders to take siding at Canterbury to let passenger train number 16 pass. When he got off to open the switch while his train was yet in motion, he in some way slipped and fell with his head directly across the rail. The entire train passed over him, and not only was the poor fellow's head completely severed from his body, but it was ground to mincemeat. Now, this report on mincemeat is one of the most gruesome descriptions I have read in the old archives. The incident happened in Ohio, 1904, and the report states, ground into a shapeless mass was the fate of an unknown man. He was killed by the Canton-Akron car that started north from this city last night shortly after 10 o'clock. The car was running at a high rate of speed, and when near the infirmary lane, the motorman saw a man step upon the track and face the light. The whistle was blown, the motorman says, but the man made no effort to escape. The car was so close upon him that it was impossible to stop and struck the man with frightful force. The car ran on some distance and was stopped. The trainmen and passengers dashed out of the car and began to look for the victim of the accident. What had been the man was found to be a shapeless mass of flesh and clothing lodged in around the trucks of the car. It was a frightful sight. The man had been literally ground to mincemeat, with the exception of his head. His body, both arms, and both legs were mixed up in one conglomerate mass, bones, flesh, and clothing being mixed together. Aside from a gash in the forehead, his face was not injured, and both feet were left intact. From one, the shoe had been torn, and the other was still encased in the shoe. People who saw the sight turned away sickened. It was necessary to send to the city for jack screws to raise the car up in order to get the body out from under the trucks. Now, also in 1904, a Kentucky farmer met with an ugly incident, but fortunately, this one survived. Dawson Turner caught his right arm in a corn shredder Saturday. The arm was taken off at the elbow, passing through the machine, coming out ground into mincemeat. His arm was amputated at the shoulder by physicians. And here we have another survivor, but we are once again back at the butcher shop. This time, the incident happened in Portland, Washington, 1907. Ground up in 5 pounds of mincemeat at a butcher shop is the first joint of the left thumb of Frank Shaland, butcher, and he is in St. Vincent's Hospital receiving attention for the injury. Shaland was operating a chopping machine in his butcher shop and talking to a customer at the same time. Thoughtlessly, he dropped his thumb from its place above the handle of the machine, and at the next turn of the hasher, the member was severed by the blade. And finally, we have a farmer who met with a train in Nebraska, 1911. Abel Schaefer, aged 32, was literally ground to mincemeat under a Northwestern passenger train. His eyes, jawbone, and hands were found by different persons and placed in a sack. Everyone knew Schaefer, but was unable to identify the remains until a cap found this morning and his mother reported him missing. And that's all I have for you now. I will be back with more gore and more stories from the newspaper archives. Take care.